The desert burned under the late afternoon sun, the horizon trembling with heat, the sky a relentless sheet of gold. Dust swirled like restless spirits around the boots of men who had already decided that survival was no longer possible. Their shoulders sagged, not from the weight of their rifles, but from the crushing certainty of defeat. Even the SEAL, those men bred in hardship, trained to find light in impossible darkness, lowered their heads. They had given up. And then came the growl. Low at first, like a distant storm rolling across the mountains, then rising, fierce, rattling the earth itself. All eyes lifted at once, pulled upward by a sound that was both terrifying and divine. Cutting through the desert sky was a machine unlike any other. An A-10 Warthog, its shark-mouth grin painted across its nose like a promise of vengeance. Dust tore into the air, whipping against their faces as the beast swept in low, so close they felt its shadow before they saw its steel. And at its helm sat a woman whose silence carried more thunder than any war cry. The soldiers who had surrendered their hope only seconds before stared in disbelief. She was not meant to be here. Not now. Not when the tide had already turned, when the ground beneath them had begun to taste like their graves. Yet there she was, steady hands on the controls, eyes burning with something stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion. She had come to turn the impossible into the inevitable. Her name was known by few, whispered like rumor in hangars and briefing rooms, but her story had always been larger than she allowed herself to admit. Long before this desert, long before the soldiers she now descended to save, she had lived in the silence between respect and dismissal. She had worn her uniform with quiet pride, knowing that eyes followed her not with admiration but with doubt. She remembered the sting of words unspoken but heavy in every glance, questions of worth, of belonging, of whether her hands could command the same fury as any man's. She had buried those doubts alongside her fallen comrades, those she could not save, those whose final breaths still haunted her in the spaces between missions. The scent of jet fuel and scorched earth had followed her home like ghosts, mingling with memories of letters never sent and voices never heard again. Nights brought no peace, only the echo of explosions in dreams, the sensation of metal shuddering under her touch, the cries of men who trusted her wings. And yet each morning she returned. She strapped herself back into the cockpit, where silence became her weapon, where judgment dissolved under the roar of her engines. Now in this barren desert where defeat had been accepted, her silence spoke louder than any command. The soldiers watched as the Warthog tilted, its nose dipping. The shark's painted teeth bared in a grin that mirrored her own unshakable resolve. She did not announce her arrival. She did not ask for faith. She gave them a storm. The injustice of it all had been building long before this moment. Orders from afar had been slow, hesitant, bureaucratic. Men on the ground had begged for air cover, begged for a chance, only to be told that support would not come, that they were to retreat and accept what fate handed them. It was a cruel bargain. Lives measured against politics, survival weighed against delay. Even the SEAL, men who did not know the word surrender, felt the silence from above and recognized it as abandonment. But she had heard. She had read between the lines of coded transmissions, seen the truth hidden in the pauses. Her orders had been clear: stay grounded. Yet in her heart, she knew that staying silent would mean condemning them. And so she rose, not with permission, but with conviction. As the jet screamed across the desert, sand erupting under the force of its passage, the soldiers straightened without realizing they had moved. Their eyes widened. One man's hand tightened around his rifle, his knuckles white. Another whispered words he could not remember later. And the SEAL, those warriors who had already bowed to inevitability, raised their heads. The storm had arrived. She banked hard, the Warthog rolling into a dive, and the enemy scattered below like ants under sudden rain. The growl of her engines was no longer distant. It was inside their bones, rattling their very breath. Fire bloomed in the desert, precise and merciless, a storm of steel and fury tearing into the ground. The air smelled of burning earth and fear. Through it all her face remained calm, her grip steady, her silence absolute. She did not curse her enemy. She did not boast her strength. She let her actions carve the truth into the earth. That hope, once thought lost, had returned in wings of thunder. The men below felt shame for the despair that had claimed them. They had forgotten that storms do not ask permission to arrive. They remembered too late, and yet just in time, that silent strength often hides in the least expected places. When the last enemy line broke, when the horizon no longer threatened to bleed into their camp, the soldiers stood in a silence deeper than the desert had ever known. Dust clung to their skin, sweat stung their eyes, but their hearts beat with something unshakable. They watched her circle once more, low and deliberate, as if to tell them without words, "You are not abandoned." The SEAL, men who rarely saluted anyone, raised their hands to their brows. Not because they had to, not because it was protocol, but because they had been humbled by a truth too great to ignore. Later they would speak of her in fragments, in half-told stories around fires, in murmurs that carried both awe and shame. They would remember how they had surrendered their will, and how she had given it back. And they would remember the line her silence etched into their souls. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the hush before the storm. As the Warthog disappeared into the golden horizon, its silhouette fading into the mountains, the desert seemed to exhale. The men stood taller, their defeat washed away not by words, but by the weight of an unshakable honor that had chosen to fight for them when even they had not. Some would later call her reckless. Others would call her disobedient. But for those who lived because of her, there was only one truth. When everyone else had given up, she had not. And when the desert demanded silence, she answered with thunder. The story lingered long after, passed from soldier to soldier, retold not for glory but for gratitude. For in that moment, every man had seen what dignity looks like when it refuses to yield. And so the reflection remains. In a world quick to measure worth in rules and voices, there is a rare power in those who stay silent until the storm they carry cannot be denied. If you are hearing this now, carry it forward. Remember her silence. Remember her storm. And remember that sometimes, when the world surrenders, all it takes is one unshakable soul to rise above the dust and remind us all what honor looks like. Now tell me, where are you watching this from, and what does her storm mean to you?